6 confessions, 1 murder, and every single one of them was a lie. No fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence tying them to the crime, because the real killer was someone else. But a prosecutor needed a win. Detectives pushed for confessions. Fear, pressure, coercion, and 6 broken souls took the blame for a murder they never committed. They lost their freedom, their families, their sanity, decades stolen, while a community believed the lie. This wasn't justice. This was a conspiracy, a buried truth, finally uncovered. Stay to uncover the full story. Like this video if you believe in justice. And subscribe. Hit the bell for the truths they don't want you to see. On a cold February night in 1985, the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska, lost its innocence. Helen Wilson, a 68-year-old widow known for her quiet kindness, was found dead in her modest downtown apartment. She had lived alone, a gentle presence in a community where most people left their doors unlocked, where the church steeple was still the tallest point on the horizon. When neighbors hadn't seen her in several days, concern turned into dread. Police forced their way inside and discovered a scene that would haunt Beatrice for decades. Helen's body was battered. She had been raped and suffocated. A pillow lay nearby, stained and compressed, evidence of the desperate violence that ended her life. Blood dotted the walls. The room told a story of a brutal struggle. In a town of just 12,000, such violence was unfathomable. For weeks, the community whispered in grocery stores, lingered on front porches, and prayed in church pews. Who could have done this? The pressure on the Beatrice Police Department was immense. A heinous crime had been committed in their backyard, and the people wanted answers. Detectives pursued leads, but they found little physical evidence that pointed to a clear suspect. Helen Wilson's family demanded justice. The media spotlight, though smaller than in big cities, burned just as hot in Beatrice, where every headline was read and dissected. The police had to solve this case, not just for Helen, but for the town's sense of safety. Weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years. The investigation stalled. Witnesses faded. Leads dried up. By the late 1980s, the murder of Helen Wilson was still unsolved, a cold case looming over Beatrice. For the town, it was a wound that never healed. For law enforcement, it was a stain that demanded scrubbing, no matter the cost. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and political pressure that 6 ordinary people, none of whom had killed Helen Wilson, would have their lives dismantled. They would become known as the Beatrice Six. And at the heart of it all was a woman named Ada JoAnn Taylor, whose vulnerabilities made her the perfect target for police determined to close the case, no matter the truth. By 1989, for long years had passed since the murder of Helen Wilson. In Beatrice, the fear had faded into unease, but the case remained an open wound for law enforcement. The small-town police force had turned over, younger officers replacing older ones, but the question still hung in the air like the smell of gun oil in a station house. Who killed Helen Wilson? For investigators, leaving the case unsolved was not an option. Careers were at stake. The county attorney's office needed a victory, and in the politics of law enforcement, a cold case solved was worth its weight in gold. The new team of investigators reopened the file, determined to deliver answers, even if it meant forcing them into existence. That was when their attention shifted to a woman who was already on the margins of Beatrice society, Ada JoAnn Taylor. Ada was just 22 years old when police first brought her in. She had grown up in difficult circumstances, unstable home life, struggles with mental health, and a long pattern of toxic, sometimes violent relationships. Her world was defined less by stability than by survival. At the time, She was living with a man who routinely belittled her. Their relationship was fraught with shouting matches and bruised emotions. Neighbors described it as a bad situation, one where Ada often seemed adrift, vulnerable, and seeking approval from anyone who would give it. She also had a history of depression and anxiety. These weren't conditions that drew compassion in 1980s Nebraska. They were stigmas, often weaponized by those around her. Ada had little confidence in her own memory, a detail that would become critical later when police suggested she might be remembering crimes she had never committed. Her vulnerabilities made her an easy target. To detectives under pressure, Ada was a puzzle piece they could force into place. One night in the late 1980s, Ada and her boyfriend had an explosive argument. The fight escalated to shouting in public, and in her anger, Ada blurted out a statement that would change her life. "Maybe I know something about that woman who was killed." It was more a cry for attention than a confession. A young woman, desperate to be heard, reached for the most shocking words she could think of. She had no idea the storm those words would unleash. Her boyfriend wasted no time repeating her claim to others. Soon, word reached law enforcement. To detectives starved for leads, it was a gift. Within days, Ada was summoned to the police station. From the moment she sat down in the interrogation room, the power imbalance was stark. On one side of the table sat trained detectives, men seasoned in the art of questioning. On the other sat Ada, a young woman, fragile, insecure, and overwhelmed. Investigators showed her graphic crime scene photographs, Helen Wilson's battered body, the pillow used to suffocate her, the bloody sheets. Ada recoiled, covering her face, but the images were imprinted in her mind. To detectives, her emotional reaction was evidence of guilt. To psychologists who later reviewed the case, it was evidence of trauma from exposure to brutal images. But the most insidious tactic was yet to come. A police psychologist, Dr. Wayne Price, was brought in. Price had an unusual theory about memory. He believed people could repress memories of traumatic events, only to have them resurface years later. He told Ada that maybe she had been present at Helen Wilson's murder and had simply forgotten. Maybe the memories were buried deep in her subconscious. To a woman already doubting herself, those words were devastating. If a doctor said she might have been there, who was she to disagree? Over hours of questioning, some bordering on interrogation marathons, detectives fed Ada details of the crime. They told her what happened in Helen Wilson's apartment, who was supposedly there, how the crime unfolded. Eventually, confused, exhausted, and broken, Ada began to repeat their story. Her confession was born not out of memory, but out of suggestion. It was a script written by police, rehearsed under psychological pressure, and delivered by a young woman too overwhelmed to resist. When Ada finally said the words detectives wanted to hear, "Yes, I was there," the investigation caught fire. The cold case, long dormant, now had a witness. In the eyes of the public, police had cracked the mystery, but there was no physical evidence linking Ada to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses placing her at the scene. All they had was her coerced confession, laced with details that investigators themselves had provided. It didn't matter. To law enforcement, the case was alive again, and Ada, fragile and suggestible, had become their cornerstone. The investigators now had what they needed, a narrative. And once a narrative takes root in a criminal investigation, it grows like ivy, twisting around facts and suffocating the truth. Ada JoAnn Taylor's confession was the first domino, and once it fell, the rest of the pieces began to topple. Ada JoAnn Taylor's words, halting, uncertain, and born from suggestion, were all investigators needed to pry open a door that should have remained shut. Once she confessed, The case against the others began to take shape. It didn't matter that the confession was riddled with contradictions, or that Ada herself doubted her own memory. What mattered was momentum. In the eyes of the Beatrice police and county prosecutors, the cold case had cracked. And now, with Ada in their grasp, the investigators turned their sights on her circle of friends and acquaintances. The first to fall after Ada was Thomas Winslow, a man she knew socially. Winslow was 22 at the time, a drifter between jobs, often on the edge of trouble, but never violent in any way resembling the Wilson murder. When detectives brought him in, they leaned hard on the same tactics: intimidation, isolation, and suggestion. The script was familiar. They told him Ada had already placed him at the scene. They showed him grisly photographs of Helen Wilson's body. They warned him that if he didn't cooperate, he could be facing the death penalty. Under that weight, Winslow began to falter. He didn't want to die in the electric chair. He didn't want to spend his life behind bars. So when detectives painted him a path out, a plea deal in exchange for testimony, he took it. He began to echo the story Ada had been coached into telling, filling in gaps the police suggested, even when the details contradicted physical evidence. The most heartbreaking collapse came from James Dean, a shy, socially anxious man in his 20s who was particularly vulnerable to suggestion. Dean struggled with low self-esteem and mental health issues. Interrogations left him trembling, drenched in sweat, his words halting. Detectives pressed him relentlessly. Like Ada, he was told he might have repressed the memory of the crime. They told him his friends had already implicated him. They warned him again and again about the death penalty. Dean's willpower crumbled. At one point, he described memories of the crime that were physically impossible, claiming he had been in the wrong room, or that Helen Wilson had been stabbed when in fact she had been suffocated. Each mistake was gently corrected by investigators, who fed him the real details until his story matched their script. By the end of his sessions, Dean was convinced, or at least said aloud, that he must have been there. He confessed, despite the fact that the details shifted like sand under his feet. The chain reaction continued with Deborah Sheldon, a woman in her 20s who lived on the margins of Beatrice society. Like Ada, she was vulnerable, struggling with her own mental health issues and easily influenced by authority. Sheldon's interrogation followed the same pattern. Police told her she had been implicated by others. They told her she might have blocked out memories of that night. They told her she had no way out unless she cooperated. Terrified, Sheldon began to parrot back what she was told. She described events she couldn't have witnessed, recalled details that shifted under scrutiny, and ultimately folded into the narrative law enforcement was building. Kathy Gonzalez was another local drawn into the case. Despite having no connection to Helen Wilson's murder, Gonzalez was a mother, living a quiet life. But detectives, hungry for more names to corroborate their theory, looped her in. They leaned on the same formula. Others had named her, they said. Evidence pointed to her. If she didn't cooperate, the death penalty loomed. Gonzalez, frightened and overwhelmed, entered a no-contest plea, unwilling to risk a trial. With 5 confessions and plea deals in hand, investigators turned to Joseph White. What was different? He was older, more confident, and less willing to be broken by interrogation tactics. When detectives presented him with the same threats, he pushed back. He knew he hadn't been there. He knew he was innocent. White refused to confess. He refused to plead. That resistance sealed his fate. Prosecutors realized they could make him the linchpin of the case, the man who had supposedly orchestrated the crime. And with 5 others ready to testify against him, their case appeared strong. From the beginning, the confessions were riddled with contradictions. Some claimed Helen Wilson had been stabbed, though she had been suffocated. Others described her apartment layout incorrectly. Timelines didn't match. None of the supposed perpetrators could describe details that weren't fed to them by investigators. And still, the case moved forward. Prosecutors knew they had no physical evidence. The serology tests available at the time had excluded some of the suspects. Fingerprints at the scene matched none of the six. Blood types didn't line up. But in the courtroom, prosecutors banked on the emotional weight of confessions. Jurors, they believed, would not be able to look past the sight of six different people. Six standing up and admitting guilt. By the end of 1989, the dominoes had fallen in full. Ada JoAnn Taylor had pled guilty to second-degree murder. Thomas Winslow, James Dean, Deborah Sheldon, and Kathy Gonzalez all accepted plea deals, trading admissions of guilt for reduced sentences and a promise they wouldn't face the death penalty. Joseph White, the lone holdout, went to trial. It was a case built entirely on sand, on coerced confessions, manipulated memories, and the terror of execution. But in the eyes of law enforcement, it was a victory. The cold case of Helen Wilson was solved. The town of Beatrice could finally breathe. But the truth was darker. The real killer, Bruce Allen Smith, had already slipped into the shadows, dying in 1992 with no one the wiser. And six innocent people were walking into prison cells for a crime they had not committed. The confessions of the Beatrice Six should never have held up in a courtroom. They were contradictory, factually flawed, and unsupported by any physical evidence. But in 1989, in Gage County, Nebraska, they were enough. Enough to convince a prosecutor hungry for a conviction. Enough to reassure a community still haunted by the violent death of Helen Wilson. Enough to condemn six innocent people to years, even decades, behind bars. At the center of this collapse stood Prosecutor Richard "Pat" Kenney, a man determined to close the case, no matter what doubts might linger. Kenney knew he didn't have fingerprints. He knew the serology results didn't match. He knew there were no hairs, no fibers, no definitive link tying any of the six to Wilson's apartment. What he did have were confessions, statements pulled from vulnerable suspects after hours of coercion. Confessions that, in the American justice system, carry immense power. Jurors, time and again, place overwhelming trust in the idea that no one would confess to a crime they didn't commit. Kenney leaned on that trust. He painted a picture of a twisted group crime, orchestrated by Joseph White, carried out with the participation of his so-called accomplices. He promised the jury that the confessions, taken together, revealed the truth. What he didn't reveal were the tactics behind those confessions, the threats of the death penalty, the suggestion of repressed memories, the corrections made by investigators when suspects got key facts wrong. For 5 of the 6, Kenney didn't even need a jury. Ada JoAnn Taylor, emotionally shattered, pled guilty to second-degree murder. She had been told repeatedly that the death penalty awaited if she went to trial. Her plea was survival, not admission. Thomas Winslow, Deborah Sheldon, Kathy Gonzalez, and James Dean all accepted plea deals. Each weighed the near certainty of conviction against the slim chance of acquittal. Each feared the ultimate penalty. Each chose years in prison over the possibility of death. Their pleas were then transformed into weapons. They became witnesses for the state, their coerced statements recycled as testimony against Joseph White. Joseph White refused to plead guilty. From the moment he was accused, he insisted on his innocence. He would not stand in court and confess to something he hadn't done. This defiance made him dangerous to the prosecutors and to the fragile case they had constructed. If White walked free, the entire narrative unraveled. If White proved innocent, the credibility of the other confessions collapsed. So Kenney built his trial strategy around making White the architect of the crime. The others, he argued, had been drawn in by White's influence. Their stories, even if inconsistent in detail, pointed to his guilt. In October 1989, Joseph White went to trial. The evidence presented to the jury was thin: no DNA, no fingerprints, no credible physical tie. But the emotional weight of testimony carried the day. One by one, the other 5 took the stand. They spoke of being there that night. They described roles they supposedly played, though their accounts contradicted each other in crucial ways. They spoke with the flat certainty of people who had been coached, pressured, and promised leniency. To the jury, it was overwhelming. 6 people, all pointing to Joseph White. White's defense attorney tried to highlight the contradictions. He argued that the confessions were unreliable. He emphasized the lack of evidence. But the tide was against him. The community wanted closure. The prosecutor wanted a conviction. The jurors wanted to believe they had the truth. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Joseph White was sentenced to life in prison. With White convicted and the others sentenced through plea deals, the case of Helen Wilson's murder was officially closed. The small town of Beatrice could breathe again. Law enforcement hailed the resolution as a triumph of persistence. Prosecutor Kenney's career advanced. But beneath the surface, the case was rotten. No forensic evidence supported the convictions. The confessions contradicted each other and the crime scene. Key details had been fed to the suspects by investigators. The true killer, Bruce Allen Smith, remained unnamed, his DNA already sitting in evidence files, waiting for science to catch up. For the 6 men and women now locked behind bars, the years stretched ahead like an endless road. They had entered prison not as murderers, but as victims of a system that prized closure over truth. And for Joseph White, the only one who had refused to bend, the fight was just beginning. For most people convicted of murder, prison is the end of the story. The verdict slams the door shut. Appeals rarely succeed, especially when confessions, no matter how flawed, anchor the case. But for Joseph White, prison was only the beginning of his second fight, a relentless, exhausting campaign to prove not only his own innocence, but the innocence of 5 others dragged down with him. White had refused to confess. He had refused to plead. That stubborn defiance, which sealed his life sentence in 1989, became the very trait that kept hope alive for the next 19 years. White adjusted to prison life in the only way he knew, by refusing to surrender. Where others might sink into despair, he sharpened his resolve. He read case law in the prison library. He studied DNA science, which was still in its infancy at the time of his trial. He wrote letters, dozens of them, to lawyers, journalists, innocence projects, anyone who might listen. His letters carried the same refrain: test the evidence. From the very beginning, White believed DNA could prove what he had always said. He was never in Helen Wilson's apartment. But for years, Nebraska prosecutors resisted. The case was closed, the convictions final. No one in power wanted to reopen the wounds. The 1990s brought a revolution in forensic science. DNA testing, once rudimentary, became increasingly precise. Old cases across the country began to crack open under the weight of new results. Men and women long thought guilty were suddenly being exonerated. White followed these developments closely from his cell. Every exoneration elsewhere gave him another reason to believe his own day would come. By the early 2000s, the Nebraska Innocence Project had taken an interest. White's persistence, combined with the glaring lack of physical evidence in the case, made his file stand out. The Innocence Project began pressing for DNA testing on the preserved biological evidence from the Wilson crime scene. Finally, in 2008, nearly 2 decades after the convictions, the court ordered DNA testing. The results were undeniable. None of the 6 defendants' DNA was present at the crime scene. Instead, all the biological evidence pointed to one man, Bruce Allen Smith. Smith had been a suspect back in 1985. He was a drifter with a violent past who had briefly lived in Beatrice. But investigators had dismissed him, focusing instead on the circle around Ada JoAnn Taylor. Now, science brought him back into the story with a vengeance. There was only one problem. Bruce Allen Smith had died in Oklahoma in 1992. He would never stand trial. He would never face Helen Wilson's family. But his DNA told the story clearly. Smith, and Smith alone, was responsible for the murder. For Joseph White, the moment was bittersweet. He had spent nearly 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The proof of his innocence was finally in hand, but it had taken nearly half his life to arrive. In October 2008, the Nebraska Supreme Court vacated his conviction. Soon after, the other five, Ada JoAnn Taylor, Thomas Winslow, James Dean, Deborah Sheldon, and Kathy Gonzalez, were also exonerated. In June 2009, the Nebraska Board of Pardons issued official pardons for all six. The board's language was blunt and clear. These men and women had been wrongfully convicted. They were innocent. For the Beatrice Six, it was freedom, but freedom with scars. The years behind bars had taken their toll. Ada JoAnn Taylor emerged deeply traumatized, her mental health more fragile than ever. She had entered prison in her 20s and emerged middle-aged, haunted by guilt over the confession she had given. James Dean never fully recovered from the pressure of his false admissions. His anxiety and trauma followed him long after release. Deborah Sheldon, too, struggled with the psychological aftershocks of years of manipulation and imprisonment. Kathy Gonzalez, who had lost precious years with her children, carried the weight of injustice quietly but heavily. Thomas Winslow returned to a world that barely resembled the one he had left, his name still stained by association with a crime he hadn't committed. And Joseph White, who had fought so hard for vindication, lived only 4 short years as a free man before dying in a car accident in 2011 at the age of 48. Their freedom came, but the price was staggering. In 2016, after years of litigation, the Beatrice Six won a $28.1 million federal civil rights judgment against Gage County, the largest wrongful conviction settlement in U.S. history at the time. The award nearly bankrupted the county, forcing residents to raise property taxes to cover the payout. The case became a national symbol of the dangers of coerced confessions, tunnel vision in policing, and the catastrophic costs of wrongful convictions, not only for the individuals, but for entire communities. Even with the financial judgment and official pardons, healing never fully came. The scars of manipulation and imprisonment lingered. The families of the six carried the burden. The community of Beatrice wrestled with the dual shame of a brutal unsolved crime and the wrongful punishment of 6 innocents. And the central figure, Ada JoAnn Taylor, continued to carry the heaviest emotional load. She had been the first to confess, the first domino to fall. She had been manipulated into believing she might have been present, coerced into betraying herself and others. Her story ended tragically in 2023 when she died at the age of 57. Her death brought the case back into public attention, particularly as Prosecutor Kenney Hazen, the man who had secured the wrongful convictions, was featured in the Netflix documentary Take Care of Maya. The juxtaposition was jarring. The prosecutor's career endured, even flourished, while Ada's life was cut short, bookended by trauma and injustice. The long road to truth had ended in exoneration, but for the Beatrice Six, it was not a triumph. It was survival, and survival came at a cost none of them should ever have paid. When the Nebraska Board of Pardons officially exonerated the Beatrice Six in 2009, The hearing room was filled with emotion, relief, disbelief, and raw grief for the decades lost. It was supposed to be a moment of redemption, and in some ways it was. For the first time, the Six were recognized not as criminals, but as victims of a failed system. But the truth of wrongful convictions is that exoneration is never the end. Freedom does not restore lost years. It does not erase trauma. It does not repair fractured families. For the Beatrice Six, the aftermath was a second struggle, this time to live in a world that had passed them by. Ada JoAnn Taylor walked out of prison into a reality she barely recognized. She had spent her most formative years, the transition from youth into adulthood, behind bars. Haunted by her role as the first domino, she carried crushing guilt, even though her confession had been coerced. Friends say she lived with the question, what if I hadn't broken? Would the others have been spared? James Dean, whose anxiety and panic had made him especially vulnerable to police tactics, emerged fragile and mistrustful. He struggled to hold jobs, struggled in relationships, and was never able to fully shake the psychological chains of his false confession. Deborah Sheldon suffered similarly, living with mental health challenges compounded by the stigma of her wrongful conviction. Kathy Gonzalez, who had lost years with her children, tried to rebuild family connections but could never reclaim the time stolen from her. Thomas Winslow sought to move forward quietly, but his name remained tethered to a crime he had not committed, leaving him battling both stigma and the long shadow of prison. And Joseph White, the lone holdout who had never confessed, tasted freedom only briefly. In 2011, just 2 years after his exoneration, he died in a car accident. His death was devastating to the group. For many, White symbolized courage, the one who refused to bend, the one who kept fighting when the rest had been broken. His absence was a wound that never healed. Justice in the American system often requires a price tag. For the Beatrice Six, that meant years of litigation after their exoneration, suing Gage County and the officials who had built the case against them. In 2016, a federal jury awarded them $28.1 million in damages, at the time, the largest judgment ever in a wrongful conviction case. The award reflected not only the years they had lost, but also the extraordinary misconduct of investigators and prosecutors who had built the case on sand. The judgment nearly bankrupted Gage County. Residents faced steep property tax increases to cover the payout, sparking anger and division. Some taxpayers resented having to shoulder the financial burden for mistakes made decades earlier. Others saw it as the only fitting consequence for a system that had destroyed 6 lives. The case became a cautionary tale nationwide, not just of wrongful convictions, but of the financial devastation they can bring to communities. For Beatrice itself, the Wilson murder and its aftermath became a ghost that would not leave. Helen Wilson's family never saw true justice. The real killer, Bruce Allen Smith, had died years earlier. There would be no trial, no sentencing, no closure in the traditional sense. For them, the revelation of Smith's guilt was both vindication and tragedy. They had believed for years that justice had been done, only to learn the system had convicted the wrong people while the true perpetrator escaped. For the wider community, the Beatrice Six case raised uncomfortable questions about trust in law enforcement, the fallibility of memory, and the cost of tunnel vision. The town's name became synonymous with injustice, a reputation Beatrice has struggled to shake. In 2023, news broke that Ada JoAnn Taylor had died at the age of 57. For those who had followed the case, her death felt like the closing of a tragic circle. Taylor had been the first to confess, the first victim of manipulation. She had lived the rest of her life trying to recover from that moment in 1989 when police broke her spirit and convinced her to doubt her own memory. Friends described her as carrying immense guilt and sorrow, even after exoneration. Freedom had come too late to heal her wounds. Her death was covered widely, with obituaries framing her as both victim and symbol, an emblem of how easily justice can be derailed when vulnerable people are coerced into confessions. The case's relevance sharpened again in the public eye when former prosecutor Kenney Hazen, who had secured the wrongful convictions, appeared in the Netflix documentary Take Care of Maya. Though the documentary was unrelated to the Beatrice Six, Hazen's presence reignited debate. How could a man whose career was built in part on one of the most infamous wrongful convictions in U.S. history still command respect and screen time? For the families of the Beatrice Six, the answer was bitter. The system protects its own. Hazen faced no discipline, no accountability for his role. His career endured, even flourished, while the lives of 6 innocent people lay in ruins. The contrast was stark, and it fueled renewed interest in the Beatrice Six story for a new generation of viewers. The Beatrice Six case stands as a stark warning in the annals of American justice. Coerced confessions can and do convict the innocent. Studies show juries almost always believe confessions, even when contradicted by evidence. Psychologically vulnerable suspects are at greatest risk. The use of hypnosis, suggestion of repressed memories, and threats of execution broke people who should never have been questioned without safeguards. Communities pay the price. Not only do the wrongfully convicted suffer, but taxpayers and victims' families also carry the burden of error. Accountability remains elusive. The officers, prosecutors, and investigators responsible rarely face consequences. The Beatrice Six remind us that the search for closure can be more dangerous than the crime itself, when the system prioritizes resolution over truth. Nearly 40 years have passed since the night of February 6, 1985, when Helen Wilson was brutally murdered in her Beatrice apartment. Her death shattered a family and terrified a town. But what followed, decades of wrongful imprisonment, coerced confessions, and systemic failure, revealed another crime, one committed not by a lone killer, but by a justice system that betrayed its own people. For Joseph White, Ada JoAnn Taylor, James Dean, Deborah Sheldon, Kathy Gonzalez, and Thomas Winslow, the ordeal was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was a theft of life itself. Today, their story endures not just as history, but as warning. Each time a suspect is pressured into a confession, each time investigators fixate on a narrative instead of evidence, each time prosecutors pursue conviction at all costs, the ghost of the Beatrice Six lingers. And as we remember Ada JoAnn Taylor, her fragility, her courage, her tragic end, we are reminded that wrongful convictions are not abstract statistics. They are human lives, broken and reshaped by the machinery of a flawed system. The Beatrice Six may have finally won their freedom, but the cost of that freedom, years lost, lives scarred, justice denied, remains a debt America has yet to repay. The story of the Beatrice Six is just one example of how fragile justice can be. If you believe these stories need to be told, and that the voices of the wrongfully convicted should never be forgotten, please subscribe and share this video. Together, we can shine a light on the truth.